Welcome to part 2 of our conversation with Scott Stornetta. If you happen to have missed our first part, it would be worth your time to go back and listen to it. We hope you enjoy this continued conversation with one of the founders of blockchain.
This is the Blockchain 360 podcast. Blockchain 360 is a podcast of interviews and discussions about the current state and direction of blockchain. Thank you for joining us today. If this is your first time listening, then thank you for coming. The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly for your enjoyment, and show notes are found at our website, blockchain360.co. Come back often and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at Blockchain360. All links discussed today are included in the show notes.
Stuart and I initially made no connection between what we had done and solving the so-called digital cash problem. Because as it was thought of then, this is all pre-Satoshi. And again, I think of this as the David Chaum era.
Right.
It was about two problems: anonymizing and avoiding the double spend problem.
Correct.
Something is spent here, somehow it has to know that it can't be respent there.
Right.
Which has this quantum entanglement kind of feeling to it.
A little bit.
And so that's where our mindset was. And so first, to the anonymity issue. It's really not. In fact, you have a terrific chain of custody. You have something that's almost exactly the opposite of anonymity.
Right.
In the Bitcoin solution.
Well, actually, I'd read I've been looking for it again, but there were some big data experts at Carnegie Mellon who actually started looking at the Bitcoin and the data there, and they said that they can actually identify probably about 35%.
I've read that analysis, yeah.
So, and that was like 2 years ago that was. I'm sure that it at some point, because you have this permanent record.
Right.
It's not like you can disappear into the ether.
Right.
It's
right.
there. And,
right.
They can triangulate and figure these things out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so the anonymity was not addressed. Similarly, the double spend problem really is not addressed. Now, this is where I would take even more flack, because do I understand that you can't spend the money twice? Sure, I understand that. But why? It's because we've got a single record.
Right.
Now, the record is replicated widely, but having a single record and saying, in that single record, can you spend the money twice? Everyone knows that if all you had was a single record, that you couldn't spend money twice.
That's correct.
And so in both cases, it sort of sidestepped what we saw as the issue. And so what really emerged was that he had this idea of making the ledger public and making it about money. And
restricting it to money.
Restricting it to money.
Right.
Making its focus money.
Right.
I give you this, you give that person that, they give
Right.
this
And that's
person
why you didn't have the
that.
connection between documents and money.
And that was really the issue. And it really goes to the heart of something. And again, I know that there are those who disagree with me, and I can respect that. But I'm more right than they are. And, at some point that will come out. What I came to understand is that money and cash are really very, very different. And that what we really are talking about is money and not cash. Okay. And there's this terrific statement from someone at the Federal Reserve I think head of research for the, what's the unit in St. Louis of the Federal Reserve?
Fred?
Well, no matter. Anyway, he says, when it comes down to it, he's talking about the Fed and fiat currencies as opposed to Bitcoin.
Right.
And he says, when it comes down to it, all money is just a ledger.
Oh, right. I've read that quote many times.
And that's a very powerful quote. And that's where it kind of crystallized in my mind
Versus currency.
versus
Money is a ledger.
current.
Currency is something physical.
Right. That what we had was just a ledger that, for whatever mathematical or cryptographic reasons, was able to muster enough trust among a certain community that they were willing to treat it as the ledger. And that's really the only requirement for money, is a community that
We'll accept it.
that is led to accept that ledger as the correct record of transactions.
Sure, a barter community could have something entirely different as long as the community agrees upon it. It is
Right.
a form of currency.
Right. And so that really tells you something about the interplay. And this is, I think, where a lot of the value add will come in the future, between the technical foundations and the level of confidence that it inspires and enables in a community.
Right.
It is not that we rely in some fundamental sense on the cryptography. And again, I understand how the math works, so just parse my words carefully here. It's that we are persuaded as a community that it meets our requirements, and so we instill it with our confidence and
Right.
trust.
Right.
And so the reason that I think it's so important to parse that is it suggests the course for future fiat but non-sovereign currencies. It is not necessarily that they have to do something mathematically that is, in some sense, completely airtight. It's that they have to do enough to persuade a community to begin to make use of it.
Well, it's the old argument of what makes the internet. It's the network itself. I mean, that was
Yeah.
the old Oracle argument. It's that once the network is large enough, then it does have validation in the network.
Right.
And you then have a large enough community that it's actually using whatever the asset be, whether it's Bitcoin or another digital coin, that it has acceptance and usability. So some of the things you said is that you weren't happy with. So the surprises were the resolution of some of the primary problems as it related to currency, money. What was the things that you're still disappointed with Bitcoin?
Well, again, I've been somewhat vocal about this, and that is, fundamentally, proof of work is not the right consensus mechanism.
Well, it's an expensive and slow.
Very expensive, slow depending on how you implement the thing, but
Sure.
it creates an arms race that is, in a sense, unbounded but by the economic equilibrium
Sure.
that people are willing to sustain. And other than that, it's not creating economic value. Now, I say other than that because certainly I've read papers that say, well, it costs a lot, but if it creates economic value that's justified by the cost, then sure, I get that. But again, I don't mean it in a negative way. What I mean it is in the sense that it tells us where to look for successors and improvements to the system.
When you're thinking about that, what are the missing elements to the technology, at least from your perspective at this moment?
Well, again, let's be clear, my opinion about Bitcoin considered as a whole. Okay. It is a tour de force. It is a bravura performance. It's a terrific bringing together of some things.
Right.
That doesn't mean that it's the right or final solution. And it's really more like the opening act, if you will. There's this.
Is this a 3-act play, or is this the opening
This is
quarter.
a multi-act play.
Multi-act play, okay.
Um, there's this joke from Samuel Johnson, who was the
Economist.
well, I'm talking about an earlier Samuel Johnson, who
Okay.
was an English man of letters.
Okay.
And he says something like this. He says, when you see a dog dancing on its hind legs, it's not that it does it well, it's that it can do it at all.
Right.
And that's really what I think, that's how we have to applaud Bitcoin. That it definitely got the ball over the net. And it has become the first candidate for a viable fiat currency that is not a sovereign currency.
Exactly.
Okay. But it is, in my opinion, by no means the final story. And again, if you wanted to cut to the chase, we talk about money in the classical sense as having three characteristics. It's a medium of exchange, it's a unit of account, it's a store of value. The reason that there's so much emphasis, in my opinion, retroactively on Bitcoin as store of value is simply because it's failed in the first two categories. And so this is the only thing kind of left. Again, it was against long odds. It had, initially no reason for people wanting to exchange it.
Right.
Okay. And yet it has found, some level of sustainability. So again, I don't want to get hate mail from people telling me that I've missed Satoshi's vision and I don't get it and that I don't have libertarian ideals myself, which I do. But it's the opening act, and I applaud it, but it's not the whole story, not even close.
So then, what is the missing elements? I mean, I often describe in the courses I teach that Bitcoin is generation 1 blockchain, and then I continue that argument by saying Ethereum is like Gen 2. Hyperledger is like 2.5. There's a debate as to what Gen 3 really is, but then there's like these Gen 4s, I refer to as Gen 4s, like EOS as an example, where you're starting to get better controls, better governance models, alternative consensus mechanisms. They seem to have solved some of the problems with regards to mining by limiting things down. And then I hear about, Akamai, the streaming service for the internet. They've come out with something that they're working with the Mitsubishi Bank in Japan, capability of 10 million transactions per second. Now, I've often argued that that's really the definition between all of these things, with the addition of governance models. But what is it that's missing from all of these, because they're all in their infancy? What is missing to actually make these truly enterprise-grade platforms where, when I first started training in blockchain, in 2016, everyone was doing their POCs. In 2017, they said, oh, we're just continuing them for implementation in 2018. And of course, by 2018, the crypto market actually came and collapsed. Nothing happened. We're now in 2019, and we're still saying to ourselves, where's the enterprise rollouts? So what's missing?
It's a great question, but I would actually rephrase it.
Okay.
First, the thing that I would say is that what makes a blockchain is an interlinked set of records that are widely distributed.
Okay.
That is an essential foundation no matter what one does. Okay. Widely distributed enough, where widely distributed really means among a broad enough group that the possibility of collusion becomes, de minimis.
Right.
Okay. On top of that, you have to make at least 3 design decisions. Okay. One is, where should what kinds of computation take place? And there's a tension between centralizing computation versus widely distributing it. But it is a fundamentally different decision than the absolute requisite of distributing the records.
Correct.
And this commingling of records and computation, and assuming that both have to take place at the periphery, is, I think, one of the fundamental
Design flaws?
misunderstandings of people that continue to work in this space. Not just a design flaw, but
is it a design flaw as it is currently deployed?
Well, first of all, it's deployed in many, many different ways.
Right.
Okay, if we're now speaking beyond Bitcoin.
Right.
And to me, I don't want to so much call it a design flaw as to say that it is not a fundamental requirement. What is a fundamental requirement is a wide distribution of the record.
Right.
The wide distribution of the computation, and what kind of computation needs to be distributed widely, and what kind of computation can be handled more efficiently centrally without violating the fundamental peer-to-peer nature of the system, needs to be handled on a much more fine-tuned or more granular scale, examining the particular use cases and whatnot.
Right.
And I think to the extent that people have blinders on and think that wherever the records are distributed, the computation must also occur, I think they're missing a major portion of the design space that's open.
The aspect of a blockchain is the different roles that miners play, or nodes. You can have
Nodes.
mining nodes as well as validation nodes.
Right.
You could have a core set of mining nodes, but have widely distributed validation nodes.
Yeah, and so yes, what you're saying is sound in my opinion. I think it goes farther, but it might be getting a little theoretical to try to take it beyond that. But the gist of that, I am very much with. The decision about consensus, or to call it differently, decisions about governance, the fact that they, in the Bitcoin paper, were intertwined with intensive computation, that also is a little bit of a blinders thing. Or to put it, maybe more, to state it in a more positive way, in physics, you talk about a phase space, all of the degrees of freedom that you have that allow you to design. And with blockchain, we have a design space, let's say. There's a governance axis, there's a distributed computation axis, maybe there's a third axis. Satoshi picked a particular point in that three-dimensional space that was very extreme, off in one far corner of the design space. Okay? Whereas the entire space is open to our working in. And as we get more and more comfortable with separating kind of the signal from the noise as to what's essential about blockchain and what is simply one species of blockchain in the Bitcoin animal, then we open up our vision as to how wide the design space is. So with that as preface, now I want to come back to your question. You said, what's missing?
Right.
I want to rephrase that. And that is, what problem needs solving? Okay. What economically driven or socially driven problem actually needs solving? And where in the design space can we find its solution?
Right.
And the issue will differ from problem to problem.
Right.
There are a number of problems that blockchain and what can be built on top of it. And again, I'm talking about sort of proto-blockchain. Blockchain, in my opinion, in its essence.
Right.
And not just Bitcoin.
Right.
But this peer-to-peering of trust, this decentralization of authority, if not control. And those are two different things. That's this broad design space. Now, it's a technology. And now it has to obey the same rules that all other technologies, which end up becoming widely used, have to obey. Namely, they have to solve an actual problem, and they have to solve it better for the people that actually want to use it in order for it to gain adoption.
I'd like to take a moment to thank the Blockchain Academy. The Blockchain Academy is an educational training firm offering blockchain training to the enterprise. The Blockchain Academy offers courses for both management and developers, offering delivery online and in live classrooms. The Blockchain Academy works with enterprise clients to create and deliver innovative training programs globally. They recently announced a new blockchain course targeted towards attorneys. To learn more about the Blockchain Academy, visit them at www.theblockchainacademy.com.
Then that brings me to a question. I mean, getting the analogy that I often use is that, and I agree with you completely, is that Bitcoin and cryptos as a whole, I lump them together. It is just a sequoia tree. It's big, it's impressive, you can't ignore it, it's just giant, but it's not the forest. And there's a lot of diversity within the forest. And I look at because there's a lot of people out there, I would refer to them as almost purists. They think that Bitcoin and blockchain are one and the same.
Right.
And I try to say to them, no, they're not. Not even in the usage in just as what we see like between various public blockchains, let alone any of the considerations for private blockchains. Just the great amount of diversity. Is there any blockchain program or platform that is of interest to you?
There are many. Again,
you want to share anyone else?
Well, understand that I serve as chief scientist at
and you
Human
can't,
Partners,
I know.
And that's a venture capital firm.
Right.
And given where we are and what we are planning to do versus what we have publicly announced, I'm not in a position really to comment on that. But let me just say that we don't in any sense feel that we have any sort of corner on the market. There are many exciting developments that we are tracking and some of which we are contributing to, not just necessarily monetarily, but actively engaged in the discussion. And it's like a kid in a candy shop. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of good work being done. But again, as much as we admire technology, it needs to be done in service of addressing a genuine need for the people that actually will use the system.
Right.
And this goes to another design principle that was taught to me by one of my mentors many years ago, of distinguishing between who does the work and who gets the benefit. What I mean by that is, oftentimes people imagine these utopian worlds, and I'm a big fan of imagining utopian worlds, okay? But in their utopian world, they imagine that some universal good occurs, and some people will just have to make sacrifices, typically the early users, in order for this wonderful social benefit to occur. That's not going to happen. One has to align who does the benefit with who does the work.
Right.
And as a result, one has to start in all humility trying to find an actual problem that needs solving and to address it in a way that even in its smallest implementation, even if in its early stages, there are some people for whom it already delivers an incremental benefit. And so it's really in pursuit of that, asking not what's holding blockchain back, but what actual problems need solving and how do I build a better mousetrap to address that problem?
Sure.
And when I do that, then I start to gain traction, I gain network effects, and then my ideas maybe have lateral areas where they can be applied to, and they become more important, and so on and so forth. But what you don't see in the real world is someone that says, I want to solve this problem with this revolutionary solution. And it's such a good idea that people will simply find a way to get to it. What you do is you have a radical rethinking about society, but a very incremental way of making it valuable to people along the way,
Right.
that it's useful. And in that way, essentially financially self-sustaining.
Right.
And that there's not as much of in the blockchain space.
Well, speaking of thoughts about solutions, what do you think of the latest announcement by JP Morgan and their coin?
Sure. First of all, let me just say that I do have a glass half full versus half empty feeling about developments, and I'm encouraged for two reasons, okay? At least. One, it's somebody who has identified an actual issue that needs solving.
Right.
Namely, think about this, okay? Our systems, even internally, if you take the JP Morgan announcement on its face value,
Right.
okay, are so arcane that we need a cryptocurrency ledger just amongst ourselves, just so that we can improve reconciliation and settlement.
Sure.
Now that's saying something big in
the
more
DTC
than one
has
way.
been doing that, though, on a broader standpoint, not just internally.
Sure. But here's the other aspect that I feel I'm constantly called to defend when I speak well of a corporate effort.
Right.
And that is, this by definition is not blockchain or cryptocurrency. Why? Because someone's in charge. And that's what I would call purist to the detriment of advancing the very future that people seek.
Sure.
The fact that someone comes up with a solution that only works in a limited sphere, or what some people want to categorize as in a permissioned world, that any whiff of that, in any proportion at all, immediately invalidates it. It's like you can't call it champagne if it's not from a particular province in France.
Right.
Okay?
Prosecco.
You know, it drinks like champagne, it smells like champagne. But no, it is, for religious reasons, not part of the revolution.
You made the point
I
exactly.
think that
people take this from a religious viewpoint.
That's
the purists.
That is too rigid a view, even for the benefit of those who have the most altruistic, libertarian, even anarchistic ambition.
Right.
Because it's a step in the right direction. And there is a decentralizing power that comes by virtue of what it takes to create an immutable record by cryptographic means that will play itself out regardless of the starting point. And frankly, we need all the improvements that we can get.
Okay. So this gets me to a question that you've probably been asked 1,000 times, and that is, where do you think Bitcoin, or not Bitcoin, where do you think blockchain is going to be in the next 10 years?
Well, we talk about this is something we do publicly talk about.
Okay, let's hear it.
Yugen. We talk about 5 areas where we see applicability, and we list them in a sequence of both chronological as well as technological complexity, as well as time to social adoption and refinement. And so let me just walk through 5 stages.
Please.
Okay. First, audit and corporate governance inside existing corporations.
Right.
Okay. We don't need to disintermediate everyone in order to realize some basic benefit that blockchain and immutable records can provide, and that is it makes existing organizations more transparent, more accountable, and operating with higher standards of record integrity.
Right.
Okay. It doesn't take a lot of a jump in technology or refinement in order to accomplish that.
Okay.
Okay. Next, I would go to what I call settlement and reconciliation. There are some industries, banking among them, the financial services space, where settlement and reconciliation consume a great deal of the enterprise budget.
Oh, absolutely.
And if we could both, well, if you create a single agreed on ledger,
Right.
there's nothing to settle or reconcile.
That's correct.
And
It's already
so
done.
settlement and reconciliation costs, essentially, at least in a spherical cow world, go to zero. And so there's a great cost savings that can simply be realized there. There are also time savings
Right.
that can be realized. And with time savings, now we start to see the first, instead of just lowering the cost or fixing existing problems, where we start to see more creative uses, okay? Because when you shorten the cycle, not just saving the money, but when you shorten the time, then you can start making decisions closer to real time.
Sure. This actually has a lot of applicability in the supply chain.
Right. And so now we
Right.
get into something that's more like the supply chain, where it's not just that we are reducing back office costs, but by shortening the time cycle, we're really starting to create new value, as opposed to, in those first two cases, sort of cost savings.
Right.
Now we're starting to make the transition to additional value creation.
Right.
And that really, you brought up the supply chain. It's a great example, because not only does it afford the opportunity to reduce settlement and reconciliation costs and cut the cycle down, it also, now we turn to the first time I've mentioned the word token, and the idea of creating liquidity for products that are participating in that supply chain in time.
Sure.
Okay. Now, I haven't talked about cryptocurrencies yet. I haven't talked about ICOs or tokens, but we just note in passing, first of all, that a distributed ledger can keep track of transactions.
Sure.
And from that, we can reify, if you will, the concept of a token. There's nothing magical there. We're just writing it down.
Right.
This went to this went to this. But we can start talking about quantization of an asset, whether virtual or backed off chain or
Right.
a piece of equity or whatever. And so I think that third area is that we're going to start to see tokens become more securitized. And for me, that means two different things. One,
So that this is more real to people.
sure.
When you say tokenizing, everybody is very familiar with, say, owning your own home or
Right.
owning a piece of real estate. So the idea that you could create a token for a piece of real estate and then infinitely divide it
Right.
is very easy to understand. So when you're talking about this idea of tokenization, it doesn't have to be, it can be a digital asset as well as a physical asset.
That's absolutely right.
Right. So the tokenization is only as it relates to that particular structure. Because
Yes.
the structure might be the supply chain. So the chain is moving, say, from raw materials to, refinement to manufacturing to distribution to the end product.
Sure.
So that product is changing, but it could be all tokenized along the way.
Right. It can be quantized,
Yes.
and therefore ownership of it can be fractionalized, and therefore assuming that and now I'll use a word for the first time, the transaction costs, which really means more than just the dollar and cent costs, but the degree to which there's friction in the system, and that friction can be lowered. All of that allows for creating a secondary market more efficiently that makes the asset liquid.
Right.
Quantized, fractionalized, liquid. And in that sense, I'm talking about it becoming securitized. And I'm sure there are aficionados in the financial services space that say, yeah, he doesn't really use that word right. And I'm happy to, concede defeat on that point. But let me just try to make a broader point. So I do think that you're going to see securitization in two senses. One, there's been obviously in the United States at least, this whole discussion with the SEC and make creators of utility tokens versus security tokens.
Correct.
I do, without going into all of that, I do think we're going to move towards the security token side. Okay. And I don't think it's as big a problem as many would think. I think smart regulation, light regulation there can be a boon for all concerned.
Well, if we know what the rules are, then it becomes easy to work within them.
So, but in an additional sense, you've already alluded to, I think we're going to move from maybe this will actually appreciate in value someday because someone else will care more about it than me, over to things that are more like traditional equities.
That's like the greater fool argument that, I'm hoping that somebody else is going to value this more. So I was the fool to get in at this point, and now you're the fool because you take it away from me.
Right. There is a point at which Dutch tulips, which have intrinsic value, start to be valued in a sense that only can be satisfied by a greater fool argument. Okay.
Well,
and what I'm suggesting
I'm not disagreeing with you.
What I'm suggesting is that I'm not speaking to secondary markets that become out of control, that bubble and even super bubble. But there are different needs amongst different people, and that's why we trade goods. And so one person's perception of the value of something could rationally be different from someone else's because of the use that they need to put to it. And that's why liquidity is a net benefit. Sure. And we gain a liquidity premium.
Right.
So realizing the liquidity premium is part of this tokenization that allows for making both real as well as virtual assets, as well as stake of ownership in an entity, which is really somewhere between a physical asset and a virtual asset. That's unlocking that liquidity premium is a fundamental value creation economic driver.
Sure.
Okay, so in the second phase, if you will, for lack of a better word, I've talked about reducing costs, settlement and reconciliation. Now we're talking about unlocking a premium, okay, by making an asset liquid. Then I think you get to a fourth phase, for lack of a better word, that's going to take a lot more time to develop, but it goes to the notion of how tokens are used in an incentive system and how that changes the nature of the corporation. Let me try to offer a concrete example and then a more theoretical.
Sure.
Okay. LinkedIn. Okay. I'm guessing that you use LinkedIn.
I do.
Okay. As do I. Okay. LinkedIn was sold to Microsoft for a little over $26 billion in cash. Now, at the time of sale, and I often say this in an audience setting with a large audience, I say, look around at you and yourself and your neighbors and think, wait a minute, I'm the one that created all of the value in that LinkedIn network. All of these colleagues and friends that I stitched together, that's what that $26 billion is. Where's my part of that $26 billion?
Sure.
And so that gives rise to this notion that social media, in a broader sense, can be re-engineered with the right token incentive structures so that we have more peer-to-peer owned and regulated networks.
Sure.
They are, after all, peer-to-peer networks. The actual relationships that we have.
Right. The relationships are peer-to-peer.
And so I think there's great opportunity there. Okay. I think, but what is often seems to fall short in business plans that I look at is it is not a business plan to say the current social media are concentrated in power and therefore those people are bad And so if I offer a non-concentrated alternative, then it must be good,
Right.
and therefore people will use it. And no one cares, except for those that are genuinely driven purely by the philosophical argument.
Right.
Again, it carries great weight in my mind, but a business plan it does not make. And so one needs to come up with, and this is just a memo to those people that are sending us business plans, okay? You've got to actually create something better.
Right.
You can't just say what is existing is bad because it's centralized and decentralized will be better. You've got to create a compelling experience,
Right.
something that adds value even for early adopters of the system.
Sure.
And until you can do that, Facebook, LinkedIn,
They're going to own the
others
asset.
that, they are doing the best job.
Right. They are.
Okay? So knock yourselves out. I know it's coming. I know you can do it, but please hurry up because we're seeing a lot that doesn't work. More theoretically, I want to go back to a seminal paper published by the economist Ronald Coase. And it was Coase who first asked the question in a theoretical sense, why do corporations even exist? Namely, if the free market is as good as it's supposed to be, why aren't we all just individual, independent agents buying and selling amongst ourselves to
Right.
accomplish the world's work? Why do corporations with hierarchical controls ever stand a chance in the free market? And what he came up with was this notion of generalized transaction cost, namely that the inefficiencies of the marketplace led to some costs that were so expensive for the market to function that it was better to organize corporations within the sea of the free market so that they could handle these transaction costs more efficiently. Okay. Now that's all, highly theoretical.
Sure.
But it's proven to be a great way to characterize systems, and that's why Ron Coase got his Nobel Prize, that among other things, for having these abstruse ideas that actually did do a good job of describing how the world seems to function. Where I'm getting at with this is I think tokens used for incentives allow us to restructure the way what we currently call corporations. It allows us to sort of create a next generation of corporation, which is more peer-to-peer, and which, rather than having a rigid, I'm inside and you're outside, becomes more of a semi-permeable membrane through which tokens are passed amongst customers, employees, what we would traditionally think of as stockholders, amongst that whole community. And again, I have to acknowledge that semi-permeable membrane analogy I owe to a colleague. It's not original with me. But I think the transformation of the corporation, the sort of corporation plus plus,
Sure.
or corporation 2.0, or if we're on 2.0, 3.0,
Right.
whatever,
Just the next version.
is very much possible to allow the token to be one of the signaling mechanisms in the economy for a kind of real-time redistribution where value creation is following in a much more real-time way, where the allocation of credit is following the value creation.
Sure.
So that would be a fourth.
Okay.
Let me finally come to a fifth, okay? And my fifth is, if you can believe it, cryptocurrencies. Now, the thing I'm trying to emphasize is, I very much believe that we're going to see fiat currencies, namely fiat meaning someone just says this is a currency, okay? Not sovereign backed though.
Okay.
I think we definitely will see part of Satoshi's and many others' dreams realized. But now you see how conservative our perspective is on this space, because we see that as a Generation 5 difficulty to get it right.
Right.
And So while we are bullish in general on the concept of the cryptocurrency as a mechanism to solve hopefully somebody's problem sometime,
Right.
that doesn't mean that what it means is we think we're very much at a nascent stage with
Okay.
cryptocurrencies.
Right.
That's a very, very difficult problem to tune right. And I do think that there are all sorts of places where good ideas are starting. But for those that have great ambitions, my advice is start small. And what I mean by that is, remember, eBay originally was a Beanie Baby trading site.
No, Pez dispenser.
A Pez, you have it even better, right?
Right.
Those classic Pez dispensers.
Right.
And then it added Beanie Babies. Touche. Okay? And some of those Pez dispensers are pretty cool.
They are cool.
Okay. Amazon, even though they had great ambitions from the get-go, okay, originally focused on books.
Right. A book reseller.
And so I have more confidence in those that are trying to solve a modest problem and solve it well, and solve it in the near term and begin to generate revenue as a result, than I do for those who admirably are trying to create be-all, solve-all foundations that take on the character of if we build it, they will come, rather than trying to solve a very focused group of people's near-term problem.
So do you see this as the approach that both industry and government should take towards it? I mean, to me, the greatest implementation of blockchain, of course, will be probably at the governmental level, simply because it will impact everyone. Is this part of the reason? I mean, everyone would like to wave that magic wand and say, we have now this solution that solves all these problems within government because it impacts everyone. But say, start small, solve a particular problem, using actually your surety example, solving the problem of patents and trademarks.
For example.
Start there. Let's get that down and get it right, and then start to expand into the additional aspects of things.
Sure, but I would not necessarily say, I take your point in part about government. Government should act thoughtfully and improving the way it handles its essential functions. Remember, you are talking to a not-so-closet libertarian. Government should handle its essential functions more efficiently and effectively.
Correct.
Okay. And I'm not suggesting that governments aren't allowed to have currencies. Okay. I think anybody should be allowed, so why not governments as well? But I don't necessarily think that government has to intervene, but for lightly, in many areas.
Sure.
Where it has some supervisory role, but not necessarily a central or, or not necessarily a central, that's its job kind of role.
Got it.
Now, when you say industry, to me, industry is both existing corporations as well as two guys in a garage. So more power to all of them.
Okay.
It's funny to me, when you see those that philosophically align themselves with the sort of letting 1,000 flowers bloom and letting everyone do what they want to do, in that libertarian sense, decrying the right of corporations to do what they want to do, a la J.P. Morgan. Isn't
Sure.
it a free country?
Absolutely.
Needs, I think, to be something that is as good for the goose as it is for the gander.
Sure.
If you've got a better mousetrap, build it.
Great.
And if you want to put J.P. Morgan out of business, just build a better.
Okay. Now, I started this interview by asking you the question, are you Satoshi Nakamoto? And you've said no. Well, given that the cryptographic community, both at the time you started creating this and now, is so very, very small. If you're not Satoshi, who is?
Next question.
Okay. Are there any more secrets that blockchain is going to reveal to us? That we're going to come out with something that will as transformative as what we understand it now. And the way that I look at it is this way, is that using the internet as the example, that original design concept of the internet was very limited. And then the secrets that came out is that we could do so much more with it. And they were secrets not because that people were hiding them, it's that they weren't discovered yet. So do you think that there are, and do you perceive that we're like on the brink of a new breakthrough in that? I mean, you brought up things like Google. Well, Google wasn't the first search engine. They were actually long after, a number of them. Amazon wasn't really anything unique at the time. eBay wasn't unique at the time. Even Apple struggled for years and years before actually that impetus, the thing that pushed them over to becoming really spectacular.
Right.
Do you see that we're on the horizon? I mean, are any of those things on the horizon, those discoveries right there, and we just have to push a little harder to actually discover them?
Absolutely. But I want to say it in a broader sense. In other words, I get that it's kind of neat having had some role to play in the early blockchain space, that I get this, I gain something of a platform to offer my perspective.
Sure.
But I don't tie myself to just the blockchain. To me, there are really two long-term drivers here. The first is peer-to-peer connectivity between every person on the planet. And the second is increasing computational power to mediate that peer-to-peer interaction. That's the long-term driver. And blockchain is, in a sense, just a natural consequence of when you get to a certain amount of connectivity and computational power, there's something that you can peer-to-peer.
Right.
So to me, the internet itself is a phenomenon like that, but something like Wikipedia is a phenomenon that's emergent because we had increased connectivity,
right,
and increased computational power. And so for me, these effects of new ways to re-engineer the social network, the human-to-human network, are just going to come in wave after wave after wave as we increase connectivity and lower its transaction costs,
right,
and as we have increased computational power that we can bring to bear in mediating our interactions. Those are the two grand drivers, and we're just going to see revolution after revolution after revolution. Do I think blockchain is there for the long term? Absolutely. And again,
are cryptos, is Bitcoin going to be there?
It'll definitely be in the historical record, no question, no question, and it'll be an immutable historical record.
That's true too.
I have a myopic view of blockchain that there is a fundamental benefit to cryptographically interlinking documents and having them widely distributed. That creates that immutable ledger,
sure,
that immutable record. But we're going to see wave after wave after wave of value add. We haven't spoken at all, for example, about smart contracts.
No.
Which I think
I tried to keep this limited.
Which I think have great value, but I think we're going to see a much more gradual and incremental adoption of very simple things first before they grow. But they really are built on top of an immutable record that all can agree on.
Right.
They're also built on top of being able to quantize and fractionalize. So we see that wave. Again, my dissertation was in artificial intelligence. Do I think that's going to have a big impact building on top of and in addition to what's happening with blockchain? Absolutely. And we look at all of that at UGen, but to each its own time and appropriate phase in the development.
Right. I want to thank you actually for appearing here on Blockchain 360. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. Like you've pointed out, there were many things that we didn't discuss, and that was just because I respect your time. Again, it's been a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much.
Thanks for the great questions.
Anyway.
It's been a great back and forth as far as I'm concerned.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly. Have a question? Want us to interview someone specific? Wish to hear about a particular topic? Let us know. You can email podcast@blockchain360.co or tweet us on Twitter @blockchain360 or at our website blockchain360.co.